Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well this morning. We've kind of wrapped up our series on finances and biblical economic vision in one way, at least, with the real meaty subjects that we've explored so far. But I do want to spend one more week with a related and a little bit tangential conversation. Like I say, we've looked at the overall picture of the Bible's economic vision in both Old and New Testaments, and we've seen these incredible promises that it holds for our world should we engage in this imagination we're invited into, an imagination of what is possible, what the Lord might desire if we're informed by love of Him and one another. But one part we haven't looked at with any kind of detail is the biblical vision for business itself. We've seen some of the things that it should kind of obtain, but what about business itself? Is it just a means to an end? You know, business has been viewed in many lights during the history of our civilization, and the effect it can have on an entire people, even on the church itself, is surprising, as you might see this morning. So let me give you an example. Today, we're seeing many calling for radical changes to business. And some of those voices want to villainize business, and especially business owners. They view money as essentially making money, a dirty enterprise. And they view it as like a zero-sum game in which if you're an owner, if you profit and profit well from your business, it's really because you've stolen the profit from the workers that you've exploited. This is quite literally, and most people who speak this way know it, is Marxist influence, communist influence in our country today. And it's widespread and it's growing. Production is a battle of the classes in Marxism, worker against owner. Marxism is by nature and intends to be divisive, turning people against each other. And that kind of thinking has the power to poison our workspaces and really our culture as a whole and make us vulnerable to very, very, very dangerous solutions. This is not the first time, by the way, that the West has imagined or reimagined business in unhealthy ways. Before the invention of the steam engine and the development of the modern factory, in what was called, and many of you will have learned of this as a child, the Industrial Revolution, around 1700s, most businesses were run by husbands and wives out of their own homes. And so it was impossible to separate the family from business, and so it was also impossible for business to be viewed as anything but inherently moral. It was a family, a household affair. It was wholesome, we might say, and it was so natural to the most basic of human relations. But because of technology, especially the boiler, jobs moved outside the home to giant and dangerous factories. And it wasn't long before families were unwilling to risk the safety of those who had previously worked in the business, even children and certainly mothers. And they decided, this is too dangerous, we'll send only the men. And earning an income became largely the man's field of view, field of work. That shook up the relationship of business to the community in ways that we are still experiencing today. Business was becoming increasingly a mechanical, depersonalized pursuit based on efficient profitability to a degree that hadn't been seen before. And at the same time, and as a result of what was going on in the world, the whole theory of economy began to change in the West. Adam Smith and theorists like him began to justify what they were seeing in the public world and even exacerbated it by unhitching business from the field of morality. In theory as well as in practice, they gave reason for why we should not let morality interfere. In fact, Adam Smith did not take it as far as would later happen in the 1960s and 70s 70s with what is called, I believe, neoliberal capitalism, where it was really taken to an extreme, and we live in that today. The results of that are profound and costly. But anyways, much of Smith's work, and economists like him, was brilliant, accurate. In fact, it lifted millions of people to this day out of poverty, but it had some fatal flaws. It was and has since become even more of a pendulum swing that depersonalized the field of business and reduced it to mere numbers. One of the countless effects of this thinking about business was that since business is amoral, that is, it has nothing to do with morality whatsoever, and since it had become the field predominantly of men, society began to view men radically differently. Up to this point, it had been universally agreed, and maybe you could find some obscure exception, but really it had been universally agreed in the ancient world that morality and virtue was the field of men and men alone. In other words, people thought men were inherently better creatures than women, and as much as that was wrong, that was agreed upon. Only men could become supremely virtuous beings. Now, the Christian medieval period really challenged that in significant ways. Today we might look back and say, well, it didn't go far enough. But man, if you're sensitive to the changes of history, they were profound in the Christian medieval period. And then in the Industrial Revolution, all this historical thinking about how virtue was more of a manly thing was suddenly flipped on its head just like that. And men began to be viewed as more beastly and with excuses because of their nature for why they couldn't be as virtuous as women were by nature. Thousands of years of thinking just flipped on its head, primarily, I would say, because of people's thinking about business. Who'd have thought that your thinking about business could have such an incredible effect? It would reach its hands into every family and every church and our very definition of the sexes. This was profoundly embraced by so many, I find it baffling. The home was moral, so since the woman stayed home more, she must be more naturally moral. But men's work was not moral, so men must not be as moral. It became a lavish compliment to call a man womanly with regards to virtue. Women were inherently superior when it came to morality. What a change that affected. My point is simple, that our view on business can have an astounding effect on our family life and our community life. Today, many people, Christians included, continue to view religion as kind of separated from business and business separated from morality for the large part. This has greatly robbed the church and society as a whole. Businesses are viewed as private affairs outside the realm of spirituality, and its integral character for the entire community is overlooked. So I want to spend a few minutes today looking at how the church can heal by just beginning the process of healing our vision for business. Before we do that, I'd invite you to pause, invite the Holy Spirit to have authority in your time together to speak His words to you and through you, and His prayers through you. You can worship by music during this time, and we begin to pray this week for our persecuted church of the month, which is Sudan. And Sudan has been high in the persecuted church rankings for many years, but it has fallen a number of spots this year, praise God, in part because of a change in its politics and its leader. Christianity is much more tolerable in Sudan now in some ways, but for Muslim background converts who become Christians, it still requires the death penalty. And it will for a number of years. I believe that the Islamic law is set to run out in a few years. And that might be turned back at that time, but right now, Muslims coming to Christ face severe persecution and death under the law. So would you pause for these things? And then maybe you can ask yourselves this question. Is working hard to get things good or bad? And how would you judge it? An interesting question that could go many different ways. Well, before we even get to the real meat of our conversation, let me mention one manner in which business is clearly a part of God's plan for ministry. Did you know that the fastest growing form of missionary activity in the world is what is called business as ministry? That is, especially in closed nations, missionaries spread the gospel by starting businesses in foreign countries, where they can witness both by their presence, but also by their distinct and virtuous business practices, which cause them to stand out among the local population. Business is a massive ministry tool, and it must not be so heathen after all. And this isn't new. When the Apostle Paul first began his missionary journeys, he spent prolonged periods of time establishing churches like Corinth and Ephesus by making the goat hide tents of his homeland Tarsus for a living. He would move there, he would set up his own shop, he would work, and he would preach in his time off. In fact, that gave us a term we use today when people perform ministry on their own dime, which is called tent making. When Paul did receive financial sending from churches years later, and he did, so that he could spread the word to new places, where do you think he received it from? He continued to receive his ability to minister to new places by receiving some of the profit of people's businesses. This is, at the very least, enough to tell us that business and Jesus are not separate. They're intertwined. Ministry cannot be performed without business on some level. It is at the very least a tool for ministry, but we're going to see today that business goes beyond just being a tool for ministry. Business is ministry. We're going to do that by looking at Proverbs 31, this incredible passage about the noble wife. Let's begin in verse 10 of Proverbs 31. A wife of noble character who can find? She's worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She's like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it's still night. She provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. In her hands she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. An incredible and moving passage. But I want to ask you this question. The sex of our subject in this proverb aside, if you were to begin describing a righteous person in the Lord, where do you think you would begin describing them? Would you start maybe with their prayer life? Well, you certainly could. Or maybe with the way they sing praises to God, and that would be appropriate. But look at where this proverb begins. Its primary focus is on hard work in service to one's family and others. And a major focus in that description of the hard work is the conducting of profitable business. Now, would you equate, is this in the least surprising to you? Would you equate business with righteousness? Would that be one of your first thoughts? Would it even be one of your last thoughts? I don't think this proverb means to be exhaustive in defining righteousness. It's not saying business and hard work explains the entirety of what it means to be righteous. It's only exploring one angle of righteousness. A person, in this case a woman, which may surprise some, is considered righteous because she's prudent and hardworking to make the lives of others better. The tireless works of her hands is moral. In verse 15, she's a provider for her household. In verse 16, she purchases land from money she's earned and then develops it for agricultural use in order to make more wealth. In verse 18, she trades. In verse 21, she supplies merchants with wares to sell from her own industry. Her fear of the Lord is expressed in the hard work of her hands, with which others recognize and praise and feed on. Her fear of the Lord is shown in business. Now, this is an interesting study in how it casts women in and of itself. It views business as a shared venture between men and women, much as the pre-industrialized world did. But the virtues expressed here are surely intended for more than women. The power of this proverb for our purposes is to observe how redemptive and beautiful, productive business is when righteous men and women engage in it. Business is a part of God's incredible creative purposes, and I dare say I expect it to be a part of the world to come. There will be some economy and sharing of the work of our hands with one another that will knit us together. In a culture like ours, it is so dangerously easy to overlook how valuable production is. We are so glutted with it. We have such a surplus of it that we easily take it for granted. We take for granted that there will always be a job somewhere else that we can take, that there's always going to be food and clothing and shelter somewhere on earth for us to find. But if we were to stop to think closely about where such resources come from, are they a given after all? Do we recognize how much we depend on one another and the unique gifts God has given some of our members to produce a living for ourselves and our community? God has created human beings to need one another. As much as we need the spiritual gifts of teaching, of prophecy, of miracles, we need the gift of business. In fact, it probably fits quite nicely under the spiritual gift of leadership and administration. I say this because I don't assume that the gifts of the Spirit are given merely for Sunday worship, but for community life of the people of God as a whole. And there is no community where there is no business. I am so struck by this woman in Proverbs 31. Her wisdom and her labor improve the lives of those around her, including the poor and needy. She's a bastion of strength, without which the earth would be emptier. Twice her strength is described. People need her, and she's strong enough by God's grace to lift them up with her. Today, we continue to have very many small businesses, as were very common in the ancient world and in the pre-industrialized world. Businesses just big enough to feed one family, perhaps, maybe a few in need. But we also have the capacity we need by God's grace for such an enormous population as our own. We actually have more than we need for such an enormous population. And that is fed by larger businesses, some that are quite small still, some that are medium, and some that are very large indeed. By God's grace, again I say, these businesses feed dozens, hundreds, and thousands of families at a time. You see, there are no societies without businesses. There is only poverty and death, literally only poverty and death. And God raises up by his gifts leaders in our modern societies who are able to produce a livelihood by their own vision and hard work. They are gifts to our communities. And countless neighbors rely on them and derive their very sustenance for life from them. Their whole families flourish because of these leaders. That's God's grace. How can we think of business as anything but holy when exercised as God intends? This means that workers and owners are not inherently at odds with one another. God has formed them for one another. No business grows without workers, and no workers eat without businesses. We cannot fall in to the bitter Marxist trap of turning people against one another. And so many today demand exactly that. Well, while I say that we can't fall into the trap of turning against one another, I'm also very cognizant that there is a need to turn people toward one another. Our culture is not completely healthy in business. The woman of Proverbs 31 works so hard for those in her life out of a selfless love for the people she profits. She lives for them. She labors for them. And it's her joy to do it. She too eats from her own work, and there's no problem with that. The scriptures apply even to, really for every labor, but even for a ministry laborer, do not muzzle the ox. If you're doing the work, let there be reward. But it's very clear that even as she's feeding herself, she has placed others above herself. She dines at a table where there's peace between her and those who have needed her. And she's also needed them for other gifts that they bring. There are criticisms of our culture that socialists absolutely have right in my mind. Our assumption today that business is about profit and not about people has devastating effects, even where it's not absolute, because very few would really think that it's either or. Either it's people or it's profit. Our leaning towards profit has caused tremendous pain. We see wealth moving rapidly in one direction in our nation right now, and that should really concern us. I'll give you a couple examples. Banks can lend every dollar that I invest in them up to 72 times. An average, as I understand it in the States, about 24 times, and in Canada a little bit less. When a bank can make up money and charge money on interest, on money that doesn't even exist, but is somehow theirs anyways. Listen, where will wealth inevitably flow? It's like dropping a boulder on a trampoline during a rainstorm. And here we are on the springs trying to get a little water. Well, it all flows towards that one heavy source. You know, that system, which is called a fiat banking system, has provided some incredible opportunities and wealth for our people. But it's yet another demonstration that where the heart isn't right, we are extremely vulnerable. Where there's no will to voluntarily redistribute wealth from those banks to the people, listen, our doom is sealed. I'm not being sensational. There is no possible way for even the entire society pulling together to compete with the advantage we've given to banks. Likewise, over the last 30 years, the pay of the average CEO of Canada's major companies has changed wildly. I dare say unbelievably. In 1989, a CEO would expect to make about 20 times that of their average worker. Today, your top CEOs of your top 350 companies in Canada earn about 250 times more than their workers. Their increase in pay has outpaced the average workers by 12 and a half times. That's wild. We could go on with stats that are astounding. It's clear not only that wealth is rapidly moving into fewer hands, but that the West is developing an elite class of people who control power to serve their own interests first. They are the first to receive bailouts, the first to receive raises and dividends, the first to be paid when things go south, and the last to be affected by their own failures. They are operating in an economy and a game all of their own where they set the rules for everybody else, and increasingly they affect politics. The wild profit margins that economic leaders expect today for their work is the primary reason why Canada is outsourcing so much of its work. We've not been seriously invested in manufacturing for decades. Instead, we've watched companies like GM, Boeing, and countless others leave for warmer climates. Not because the companies couldn't be run profitably in Canada for the most part, but because they could not be run as profitably for their executives in particular and their shareholders as they could be in Mexico. We're constantly fighting this battle as a country and as a province of trying to incentivize business leaders of big businesses by lowering taxes and maximizing shareholder interests just to get them to work here because of how they think about business and how that has affected their hearts. Particularly, this is true in the case of big businesses, not so much in small businesses. In big businesses for whom the sky is the limit and the world is wide open for wherever they want to work, for them it's not enough to make a profit. One must have to make the most profit. Even, for example, with the divestment of oil and gas industries in Alberta over the past years, and we might be right to criticize the restrictions that have driven it out, there's another side to the story. It's not that oil has become unprofitable for everyone in the industry. It's that it has become less profitable than it is somewhere else. And when business is not viewed as intrinsic to community, to people and people groups, businesses chase profit all over the world, wherever they can find it. There's no loyalty to people. Loyalty is to a number. Now, that's not true in every case, and not every business has been able to remain profitable, but it is true in many cases and demonstrates a problem in our thinking that has affected our hearts. And here's another point I want to make on this. This vice that I've described is not unique to big businesses. I use them as an example because it's easy for us to believe about the big bad guy or the bad big guy. And maybe it's clearest in their examples. But I've sat down with school administrators in my own backyard, facing financial crunches, and their attitude was entirely the same. They've shamelessly sat in a chair across from me, looked me in the eyes, and told me that to deal with a shortfall, they will offer an ultimatum to their teaching staff of a 20% cut or you can walk. When I asked what cut they as a leader would assume in solidarity with the people they oversee, the answer was a very brisk nothing. This isn't leadership. Protecting yourself at the cost of those you're responsible for is predation. I said to that administrator what I say to you, and I knew she would roll her eyes at me because it seems so naive. But I truly hope as a believer in Christ, you will not. What we need most in our economic vision right now is a heart change. No theoretical structure, and we've had many good ones. But no legislation, and we've had many good laws. None of those things can ultimately protect people from harm when the human heart is determined to serve itself. And this is why the church must reclaim business as an essential part of the community God intends to build, as a spiritual gift, as a ministry. It is as much a part of the church as song leading and preaching and charity. It is a form of worship. There is no community, there's no life, there's no church without business. And our hearts will not be truly turned towards one another, owner and worker alike, until business is included under the umbrella of the community of God once again. Something so essential to our well-being cannot remain an outlier without devastating effects, and we're seeing them. What does this mean practically? Well, let me be honest. You have to explore that for yourself. But it certainly means some general things. It means that leaders must view themselves as existing for their workers and seek their workers' prosperity as an end in itself, not just a means of their own wealth increasing or a product. The people entrusted to them have to be an end in themselves. Business leaders are providers for the members of their extended family, which is the business. They are lifeblood to their people. And workers, on the other hand, must view their leaders as God sends to a people who would perish without the vision that they possess. Business is holy. Business knits us together. The reason why so many people are embracing socialism today and even full-blown communism is that they see that something is missing from our world of business. And they know that a world in which business is reduced to depersonalized figures is a world of turmoil and upheaval. But their medicine will prove worse than the disease. History has had enough time to absolutely prove it. Giving all the power of business owners to even fewer people in government will result in horrible incompetence, as it always has, in unbelievable abuses, and in dire results overall. 35 million people starved as a result of this in China alone in just one period of decades. And millions more were systematically murdered for various other reasons directly and indirectly related to communist governments' economic utopian visions. The church is a unique place to offer a real solution. The gospel has bite, and you must allow it to in your life. We don't solve our problems by relying on laws or coercion or power. We use those things, they are by far second fiddle. The only power we rely on to create the society that God has called us to is the power of conversion that visits every human heart one at a time by God's Spirit when we turn to Him. That conversion that turns us toward one another in self-denying love. If people saw this in the church, we would not only see a solution to the economic issues of our nations, but we would provide an irresistible testimony to the reality of our King by the generous kingdom He creates in us. When individuals are put in touch with God, is what I'm saying. Power does not have to be centralized, because centralizing puts us at tremendous risk of abuse. Rather, it's spread out and entrusted to those whom God has gifted to address each individual situation. I want to urge all of you, leaders and workers alike, to take to heart what has been described here and ask the Lord what your part in restoration is. You have been entrusted with a particular responsibility that the church can give general direction on, like I have today, but I cannot micromanage it, and the church can't for you. It's your gift. This is where you meet God. It's your responsibility. It's your opportunity. No one can answer it like you can. It is your imagination that gets to bring out the good things which the good man, Jesus tells us, stores in his heart, or the evil things that are in the heart of the evil man. What will your actions reveal to you about your heart? You have to go beyond what is common to the people around you and just everyday thinking. You have to go beyond even what is lawful. Is there anything distinct, anything radical, anything inexplicable to an unbeliever about your engagement in business, either in how you serve the ones that lead you or how you serve the ones you lead? Are your dreams somewhere out there, or are they equally right here with the people God has set in your life? Business is real ministry. It's intrinsic to the people of God. It is meant to move in harmony with every other ministry God has given to His church. A person of noble character is known by their business. Why don't we close with questions and prayer as we always do? Firstly, our questions. Number one, how do you see people think about business in the culture around us today? How is it commonly perceived, that word? How have you thought about business up to this point? Number two, were you surprised that Proverbs 31 focuses almost exclusively on the noble woman's profitable business practices when describing her righteousness? Why did that surprise you, or why didn't it? And finally, number three, having heard all of this, if any part of it has created a glimmer in your imagination, what part do you play in integrating our communities into greater wholeness and unity by the way you both understand and conduct business? Is there anything God is directing in you? Why don't you pause and discuss those? Finally, our prayer list. And I'm just going to continue on with the prayer list that we've been praying all through this series, because I really believe these are the high notes that I want us to just hammer on before the Lord. And maybe you found more. Pray that this study will have an effect on our hearts, our imaginations, our actions for the rest of our lives. That we will find freedom and purpose more reliable than wealth, but in which our wealth can be a tool to obtain greater things, or in this case, our businesses, and whatever role we have in them. Pray for our nation, where so many people are torn by the master of money and other lifeless overlords, and this has destroyed business in so many cases, and destroyed lives with it. Pray for transformation as a people, and keep praying according to your wisdom for the current situation we're in with regards to COVID, risks of health, and restrictions, which also have their risks. May the Lord lead you in that and lift up our churches, especially Clive Baptist and Clive Community. God bless you and keep you. I look forward to seeing you again, or maybe this is only going to be a one-way relationship, and speaking to you again. God bless.